This is the Andrea Doria, or at least it was when it was still floating. 3 years after it was launched in 1956, it collided with another ship and sank to the bottom of the ocean. Unlike the Titanic decades earlier though, almost all of the ship's 1,706 passengers and crew were saved. 46 people would end up dying in the sinking, but a much worse disaster was ultimately averted. That is not the end of the story though. After sinking, the ship would come to rest over 200 feet or 60 meters deep on the ocean floor in remarkably good condition. Divers who explored it in the following few years said it was much the same as when it was on the surface, almost like a time capsule. And for this reason, it became popular as a dive destination. But it didn't stay pristine forever. Saltwater and strong ocean currents have been wearing away at it ever since, breaking it down and making it more dangerous. Sections are collapsing, it's filled with rope and cables, and it's impossibly dark in its maze-like corridors, not to mention the depth to reach it and the strong currents in the area. It's for these reasons that the Andrea Doria shipwreck has been slowly accumulating a second death toll, possibly making it the most dangerous shipwreck on Earth. These are some of those incidents, and as always, viewer discretion is strong. On July 25th, 1956, a ship known as the Andrea Doria was nearing the end of what should have been another successful crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. The Italian liner had left Genoa days earlier, then made a few stops before heading west for New York. By that Wednesday night, the ship was less than a day from port, and for the passengers aboard, the long voyage was almost over. For the crew, the hard part should have been behind them, but instead, the vessel was moving into the stretch of ocean where it would come to rest forever. Several years earlier, in 1953, the ship was launched as one of the pride pieces of the Italian line and was a sleek post-war luxury liner. It was built with style and prestige and was meant to be the kind of ship that would make an impression at almost 700 feet or more than 213 meters long. Off the coast of Nantucket, Massachusetts that night though, elegance would mean very little as the weather had turned visibility into nothing. As the Andrea Doria approached the busy shipping lanes off the northeastern United States, it encountered thick fog coming across the water. Simultaneously, somewhere out there, another passenger liner was coming the other way. It was the Stockholm of the Swedish-American line, an eastbound ship built with a reinforced bow strong enough to handle ice. In clear weather, the two ships would have passed each other without much notice. In the fog, however, with both vessels moving fast, by the time the Andrea Doria finally detected the Stockholm, it was already much too late. The men in command of the two liners misread each other's movements, and in those final moments, the Andrea Doria cut across the Stockholm's bow. The bow then slammed into the Andrea Doria's starboard side and ripped open a massive hole. The collision was so hard in fact that part of the Stockholm's bow remained lodged in the Andrea Doria even after the crash. The ship's keel was cut into and one of its starboard fuel tanks was ripped open. Water rushed in immediately and power to the entire ship was lost, triggering the dim emergency lights. The immediate flooding then threw the ship badly off balance. Almost at once, the Andrea Doria began to list hard to starboard. The ship was also top-heavy to begin with, and once it started leaning, the problem began to feed itself. This became severe enough that half the ship's lifeboats could not be launched at all. That alone could have been enough to turn the collision into an outright catastrophe. The great fear, of course, was anything that mimicked the fate of the Titanic. Whenever a major passenger liner was struck in the dark and began to take on water, that story was never far away in the minds of those on board. And here too was a crippled ship, a cold ocean, passengers suddenly thrown into chaos, and not enough usable lifeboats for everybody. Thankfully though, the Andrea Doria didn't vanish in as little time as it took the Titanic to eventually sink. The ship remained afloat for more than 11 hours after the collision, and that amount of time was crucial. What followed was still a disaster, but it wasn't the kind of catastrophe it might have become. The crew was calm and effective, and communications were much better than they had been in earlier maritime disasters. Other ships responded quickly, and the rescue efforts began fast enough to prevent the loss of life from climbing into the hundreds or even thousands. In the end, 1,660 passengers and crew were rescued. That number is the reason the Andrea Doria is remembered not only as a sinking, but also as one of the great sea rescues of the 20th century. With all of that said though, the collision would still kill 46 people aboard. After the survivors had been taken off, the vessel remained alone in the sea for hours. The damage was too severe to attempt to tow it, and the list kept getting worse. There would be no saving it, so on the morning after the collision, the luxury liner finally rolled over, capsized, and slipped beneath the Atlantic forever. The ship came to rest in the deep water off Nantucket, damaged but still recognizable, and almost immediately it began to attract attention. What had gone down as a famous passenger liner would quickly rise again in another form, as one of the most coveted, most dangerous dive sites in the world. And in the years that followed, the wreck would claim a second set of victims. The wreck of the ship now sits at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, about 50 miles south of Nantucket and about 100 miles east of the New York coast, which isn't exactly close. Despite this, divers were already heading out there the same year the ship sank. In 1956, American diver John Light launched one of the earliest expeditions to the Andrea Doria, and what those early teams found only added to the wreck's reputation. Interestingly, the ship had not yet been reduced to a twisted bangle of scrap. It looked, in many ways, like the Andrea Doria people remembered from the surface. It was still in one full piece, and much of the vessel remained intact. Even decades later, it was said to be like stepping into a disaster that had only just happened. This eerie sense of preservation became part of the wreck's legend. It also helps explain why the Andrea Doria became such a fixation in the diving world. For a time afterward, the wreck gave divers plenty to see. The top of the ship initially sat around 162 feet or 49 meters below the surface, which was deep enough to be serious from the start, but still within reach of highly skilled divers. And in those early years, the wreck's condition made exploration especially alluring. There were spaces to enter, features to recognize, and artifacts to recover. Treasure hunters, photographers, and serious wreck divers all found reasons to make the long trip out. Over time, this reputation only grew, and so did the bravado surrounding it. It's a title that seems to be tossed around the diving community for a handful of spots on Earth, but the wreck became known as the Mount Everest of scuba diving. The wreck was the kind of dive that serious people trained for, planned around, talked about for years, and sometimes built entire ambitions around. The problem, of course, is that wrecks don't always stay the same. The Andrea Doria was being worked on every hour of every day by saltwater, current, pressure, corrosion, and time. By 1980, the wreck had already changed dramatically from what earlier expeditions found, and marine growth covered much of the ship. Rust was everywhere, and the strong current helped strip away major parts of the structure, including the bridge and funnel. Areas that may have once been navigable had become more broken and unstable, and that process has only gotten worse. By 2016, the deterioration had become even more severe as large sections of the ship had collapsed into themselves. In fact, areas that once existed as destinations for divers are now gone for good. That gradual destruction alone made diving the wreck that much more dangerous, but that's far from the only thing divers have to account for. Its depth also places it far beyond ordinary recreational diving, with portions of the wreck extending to depths exceeding 200 feet or about 61 meters. At that depth, everything becomes more serious because of the effect water pressure has on the body. Down that far, it's extremely cold, and divers have to contend with powerful water movement at the surface and below it. Depending on the conditions, a diver might have dozens of feet of visibility or almost none. Near the wreck, stirred up sediment can make things even worse, and on top of that, inside the ship, it can be pitch black. No sunlight reaches the bottom, so once silt is kicked up in the interior, a diver might not be able to see instruments as close as those worn on the wrist, let alone the surrounding structure. Even when visibility is good though, the ship also lies on its side, which throws off your orientation. Stairways, walls, floors, and ceilings can become hard to distinguish, especially in darkness and silt. All of that alone can feed panic, but the interior is also unstable, cluttered, and loaded with hazards. Pipes, cables, debris, and discarded ropes all create points where a diver can get caught, and entanglement is a major fear, and for good reason too. Of the divers who have lost their lives exploring the Andrea Doria, more than a third are said to have suffocated after their hoses, tanks, or appendages became caught in nets, lines, or other debris. Then there's also the issue of time. A dive to the Andrea Doria is not exactly a quick drop and return. These dives are carefully staged and often stretch from 2.5 to 3 hours when stops to prevent decompression sickness are factored in. And again, also because of the depth, diving the Andrea Doria demands advanced equipment and gas planning. Divers train for years for dives like this, using a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium to manage the physical effects of pressure at depth. By the summer of 1985, getting down to the wreck was already considered a career highlight for many divers, and that's exactly what it was meant to be for John Ormsby. He was from Key West, Florida, and he worked as a professional diving guide, a boat captain, and a civilian auditor for the Navy in Key West since 1981. He had reportedly made more than 50 descents to wrecks as deep as the Andrea Doria before. He was part of a 9-man team of professional divers assembled by MediaTek that had flown to Nantucket to recover and photograph China from the Andrea Doria's dining room. These items were valuable enough at the time to get hundreds of dollars for a single plate. The trip was also meant to help survey the wreck ahead of a later anniversary dive. On the morning of July 30th, conditions were said to be perfect. The sea was calm and visibility was just about pristine, which can be a rarity for this part of the Atlantic. John and his diving partner, Billy Dean, were the first pair to descend that morning, and they expected to spend about 20 to 25 minutes exploring the wreck. 17 minutes after entering the water, though, Billy sent up a slate with a short message on it. It informed those topside that John had become trapped in a hole. A standby diver was then sent down immediately, and what he found confirmed everyone's worst fear. John was down around 204 feet or 62 meters and badly entangled inside the wreck. He had become caught in the ship's electrical cables and in transverse lines that other divers had used and left behind. Horrifyingly, by the time rescuers reached him, John was already lifeless. It happened in the ship's foyer near a dining area that divers often headed toward in search of souvenirs. Inside the Andrea Doria by 1985, though, the space had been transformed by the constant deterioration of the wreck. Other divers tried to free John's body, but the men attempting to reach him found themselves getting tangled in the same mess of cables and lines. They did manage to free themselves, but John remained where he was. Interestingly, while trying to recover John's body, the divers found things that showed how fast the situation spiraled. John's knives were literally still in sheaths on his belt, and his cable cutters were still in his pocket. He had all the tools that might have saved him, but whatever happened down there seemed to have unfolded too quickly or chaotically for him to use them. According to reports, he may have panicked after becoming trapped, and at more than 200 feet inside a dark wreck, with cables wrapped around you and air running down, it's not difficult to see why, if that was the case. John's body was so entangled that he couldn't even be recovered the same day he disappeared. It remained inside the Andrea Doria for nearly 24 hours before other divers were finally able to bring him back to the surface on the afternoon of July 31st. His official cause of death was drowning, and John became the 10th diver known to have died at the Andrea Doria since the ship sank. Several years later, 33-year-old Robert Santulli from Port Jefferson, New York, was believed to be on his first trip to dive the wreck. He had already done dives in the 180-foot to 200-foot range, and on July 12th, he and another diver were launching from a 60-foot boat on the surface. Somewhere inside the wreck, though, at a depth of 210 feet or 64 meters, things began to unravel. According to a Coast Guard investigation, Robert became disoriented and panicked while inside the Andrea Doria. Investigators believe that he might have suffered from oxygen poisoning after making a second dive to the wreck while using compressed air instead of a mixture of gases that is customary for such a dive. At those depths, breathing ordinary compressed air can produce dangerous effects. A diver might not think clearly, or they might become confused or behave irrationally. At some point, Robert's own regulator fell out of his mouth, and he never recovered it. Whether that was a product of panic, confusion, or physical distress isn't entirely clear, but it was devastating all the same. Robert then actually grabbed his partner's breathing apparatus and ripped it away, proving the adage in the dive community that a panicked diver is a dangerous diver. In that moment, all their training and planning gave way to something much more primal. His partner had to clear water from his own equipment and was forced to head back to the surface right away, leaving him unable to help. Meanwhile, Robert simply drifted out of sight. Eventually, he went limp and lifeless. Other divers from the boat returned to the site the following day and were able to recover Robert's body. Another 5 years later, for Richard Roost, diving had long since moved beyond hobby status when his time came to dive the Andrea Doria. He had more than 20 years of experience in the water, had trained recovery teams for the police departments in Michigan, and was comfortable with both recreational and technical diving. People who knew him understood exactly why the Andrea Doria called to him. Richard's path to diving had started decades earlier after a snorkeling trip in Cancun in the late 1970s. What began as a passing interest quickly turned into an obsession. He became a regular customer at a scuba shop across the street from the garage where he worked in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in 1985 he bought the shop himself. From there, diving stopped being something he did and became something he lived around. He even earned the nickname Scuba God from those he dived with. On July 8th, 1998, Richard was one of 16 divers exploring the wreck that day, and he entered the water with another diver, Steve Berman, only about 10 minutes apart. On a dive like this, with the long ascent and the anchor line serving as a kind of lifeline back to the boat, the two men expected they would at least be aware of each other at some point on the way up. Richard had calculated that his entire dive would take around 80 minutes, so based on that plan, he should have been back above by about 2:20 in the afternoon. At 2:38 p.m., Steve pulled himself onto the deck of the boat and immediately realized that something was wrong. Steve then mentioned that as he had come up off the wreck, he had noticed that an area called Gimbel's Hole was clouded with stirred-up silt. That might have suggested that Richard had gone in there. As the hours passed without Richard's return, the atmosphere changed from concern to full-blown search. By 6 p.m., a Coast Guard helicopter from Cape Cod was overhead, sweeping a wide search area around the wreck site. The first search teams entered the water at around 6:30 that evening, and having no idea where Richard had gone, they had to try to work out his whereabouts as they went. At 7:15 p.m., one of the divers below sent up a white slate that reported no sign of Richard in either the wreck's pool or Gimbel's Hole. The search for Richard then resumed the next morning. At 9:37 a.m., two more divers dropped down and worked through the kitchen, then the stairways and the dining rooms. At 10:31 a.m., another slate came up to report they still found no sign of Richard. By that point, 15 divers had taken part in the search effort, and the only thing they recovered was Richard's strobe light, which he had clipped to the base of the anchor line before heading into the wreck. This meant that he had reached the wreck, set his marker, and then entered the ship expecting to come back out the same way. At 12:15 p.m., another two divers went down, this time heading for the promenade deck. This was an area where Richard had apparently believed it was hard to get lost, yet somewhere inside the wreck he had vanished anyway. That afternoon, one of the divers finally found his body. It was discovered wedged between two tables deep inside the ship in the first-class bar and lounge area. He was found face down at 213 feet or 65 meters. Strangely, despite how he was found, there was no sign that he had become trapped or entangled in the way that some other Andrea Doria victims had. The immediate cause of his death was not clear at the time, and an autopsy was scheduled, but the results were never reported on. With John, there was at least visible evidence of what claimed his life, but the death of a man known to others as Scuba God remains a mystery. Now, as was already mentioned, divers have been visiting the Andrea Doria for decades, and it basically began moments after the ship settled at the bottom of the Atlantic. Only a week after it slipped beneath the water, people were already planning explorations. For divers, photographers, and expedition crews, it was a rare opportunity, and William Edgerton wanted to be among the first to see the ship in its new resting place. He was a member of a privately financed expedition of around 20 people preparing to film the wreck site, with shooting expected to begin on August 2nd, 1956. Before any serious filming began, though, there would be equipment checks and practice work. The practice dive took place not at the wreck itself, but in Nantucket Harbor in only about 12 feet of water. William went down with a breathing apparatus that used 2 bottles strapped to his back, one filled with oxygen and the other with nitrogen. William descended, reached the bottom, and tested the setup successfully. Then he surfaced alongside the boat and said he wanted to go back down for a few more minutes. When 10 minutes passed and he had still not come up though, someone used an electronic underwater megaphone to call to him, but there was no response. A search began, and before long, his body was found on the harbor floor. Once he was discovered, William was brought back to the pier, and a doctor opened his chest and was literally massaging his heart by hand in an effort to keep him alive, but it was all for nothing. William was pronounced dead at 6:10 that evening. Now, obviously, this didn't take place at the Andrea Doria, but in a sense, William's death feels like the earliest warning sign. Many years later, by 2011, the Andrea Doria had been on the bottom for more than half a century, and that year, Michael Laprade had spent 6 months training to dive there. He had previously made deep shipwreck dives in Belize, Mexico, and along the west coast of the US, so he had extensive experience. When July 24th arrived, Michael reached the wreck site aboard the charter vessel, the John Jack, but there was already a grim atmosphere about it. Just days earlier, a 64-year-old man aboard the ship had suffered cardiac arrest and died despite the crew's attempt to revive him. Again, it was unrelated to the Andrea Doria, but it still cast an eerie shadow over the trip all the same. Michael was one of 3 divers going down to the Andrea Doria that day. After entering the water, though, and beginning his descent, he apparently let go of the shot line and just vanished. Michael had gone down with a partner, but at some point his partner lost sight of him and couldn't locate him again. The 2 remaining divers began the slow process of ascending, hoping they might spot him on the way up, but they didn't. And because of the depth and decompression stops, they couldn't ascend quickly to let everyone know what happened. When the 2 divers did finally make it back to the John Jack, they told the rest of the crew about Michael's disappearance, and the Coast Guard was notified at 12:11 p.m. While other divers went back below the water to look for Michael, a helicopter, a plane, and a boat searched the surface. Since he had become separated from the line, the strong current could have potentially carried him away, so the search was trying to find a man who could have been below, above, or somewhere in between. However, just 3 hours later, fellow divers found Michael's body in roughly 225 feet, or more than 68 meters of water, near the Andrea Doria. He was brought back to the surface at 3:40 p.m., and it was determined that Michael had 6 hours of air in his tanks and had been underwater for less than an hour when he disappeared. He was equipped for a long technical dive, but something happened that caused him to lose his grip and sight of the rope. The Andrea Doria's location means that separation from the descent line can be a death sentence. If a diver loses that line in such a strong current, he can be pushed away from the ascent route and lose his bearings in the water column. And given that he had gas left in his tanks, it seems likely that at some point, somehow, he lost his regulator and drowned, although to be clear, this is speculation because the actual cause hasn't been published. Maybe most tragically, Michael's father had reportedly begged him not to make the dive because the Andrea Doria was known to be so unsafe. In the aftermath of his death, that warning came off as a premonition. Michael was listed as the 16th person to lose his life in connection with the Andrea Doria since the ship sank. As of 2017, reports conclude that at least 18 divers have lost their lives on or preparing for excursions to the Andrea Doria wreck site. And as far as I can find, there are no shipwreck dive sites on Earth with a higher death toll. With that said though, as is the case with the real Mount Everest, it's not clear if the death toll is simply higher because so many people have dived the wreck. Even if that is the case though, it's clear that a variety of other factors like depth, the decay of the ship, the current, and the darkness inside still make it one of the most dangerous dive sites and possibly the most dangerous shipwreck on Earth.